like to welcome you to this afternoon's session, Marxism 2014. My name's Jenny Austin. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party from Birmingham. I'd like to introduce our speaker here, which is Ronnie, and he's going to be speaking for about 35 minutes.
I'm doing another talk on Sunday, the usual talk on Turkey. That's been put into Elvin Hall because there'll be lots of people. But personally speaking, I find this in some ways much more interesting, in two ways particularly. Firstly, because one tends to get bored about what the Turkish government has just done and what it will do and how can we bring it down, and going to 7 meetings a week, finding a way of doing that does tend to get a bit tedious. Whereas the sweep of human history and crucial moments in that history, like this, I find much more exciting. It's also quite exciting in this particular case because it's a case where Marx and Engels wrote about without knowing any of the things that I'm about to tell you and show you. So there's theory, and then facts come up, proof comes up that the theory's absolutely correct. So I find that quite exciting as well. Okay, if I go a bit further back than Catalhoyuk. Catalhoyuk, by the way, Çatal means fork, like a fork in the road, and Huyuk is a tell. So this is just a mound in the middle of Turkey. But to go further back, about 150 to 200,000 years ago, we happened. Modern Homo sapiens, human beings as we are. Within about 100,000 years, so about 70,000 years ago from now, they came out from the northeastern, or this way if I'm doing it for you, the northeastern corner of Africa into the Middle East. Some of them moved on along the southern shore of Asia, reaching all the way to Australia. Some turned left from the Middle East and moved through Anatolia into Europe. So that about 40,000 years ago they were in Europe, 45,000 years ago they were in Australia, and about 12 to 15,000 years ago they crossed the Bering Straits and went into North America. So that's the general story. All these people were hunter-gatherers. They lived in small groups of 20 to 50 people, hunting and gathering, and just moving on whenever resources in a particular area got thin on the ground. About 15,000 years ago, just about here, a change started taking place. And we get a culture which is now known as the Natufian culture. About 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, where there are signs that they began to settle down. They were semi-sedentary. And there are signs almost of agriculture. Not quite. Crops are not domesticated yet in this culture, but there are signs that they're inching their ways towards that. So that's 12,000 years ago. And then, here, there's the first signs of proper agriculture, about 10,000 years ago, and then I leap, and this is what we're talking about, Catalhoyuk, right in the middle of the centre of Turkey, where there's a settlement which has been excavated now for more than 20 years, where people are completely settled. This is a village, but it's huge for the time. There's about 8,000 people, which is big even for a modern village. About 2,000 houses. Very interesting, no streets. All the houses are stuck together. Entry into the houses is from the roof, so there's a ladder down one wall. They go up. A lot of life takes place on the roofs, and there's a hole on the roof. They get into the house. They have domesticated sheep and wheat, not cattle yet, and no other crop. You get into the house, it's full of art. Every house is full of art, paintings, sculptures, figurines, mainly of bulls, deer, leopards, vultures, and human figures. They have very finely polished stone tools. They hunted, as I said, they've domesticated sheep, but they hunted wild cattle, pigs, horses, and a very large number of plants. And it's by a river. Central Turkey today is semi-arid, but at the time it was much less arid. So this village is by a river, so they use a lot of fish and various water products. They have long distance trade, and we know this because there are date palms found there, which indicates storage baskets coming from the Middle East. There are seashells, which we know to be from the Red Sea and from the Mediterranean. Obsidian from Cappadocia, which is also in central Turkey, but it's 90 miles away from this place. And the oak and other timber comes from at least 6 miles away, because the nearest highlands are 6 miles away. Nevertheless, the economy is still primarily a subsistence economy. Now, the first man to discover this place and begin to excavate it was an Englishman called James Mellart from the University of London, who excavated for about 4 years, in 1961 to 65, tiny bit of the mound, but he did find quite a lot. And then there was a gap, nothing happened, and since 1993, Ian Hodder has been leading the excavations for 22 years now. That's what it looks like as you approach it. Not very impressive. That's the cover over the digs. That's an imaginary, as you can guess, picture of what he would have looked like 10,000 years ago. As I explained, this is just what are called middens. They're full of rubbish and shit, which is very useful, which is extremely useful because it tells us all sorts of things. That's a miniature model of what the houses would have been like. This is in Konya, which is the province of modern Turkey. This is it. This is in. I actually think this is wrong because they've put windows and there were no windows. Now, there are villages not far from this place where people actually live in a very similar way. You would get this scene in some villages in central Turkey today, but also, interestingly, oh, sorry, this is just the inside of a house. That's a bull's skull, a real bull's skull, plastered over. More of them here. They would have vulture heads in the walls. And there's loads of discussion about what this meant. No one knows, of course, so I won't go into it. This is a plan of Catalhoyuk. Every little square or rectangle is a house. I will say more about this, but you'll notice all the houses are pretty much the same size. There are no palaces. This is the slide I thought was going to come up. This is Southwest United States. The year is 1900, Native American village. Almost exactly the same as the imaginary picture we just saw. Okay. I won't say very much about it. This is just pictures I took of the site. But you can see how well preserved it is. The walls come up to here, and they would, every now and then, a house would be demolished and rebuilt at the same place. So that's how you get the mound. It sort of gets higher all the time. And they have, practically every house. They have the walls, the rooms, the ovens, the hearths. You see, there, for example, this is one house, and you can see the different rooms. It looks empty now, but there were loads of artifacts in most of these houses. But of course, as they were found, they were carried to a museum in Ankara. So what you need to do if you're really interested and you think, yes, I must go and see this, first of all, do not go in August. Go in September or April, May. But on your way, stop in Ankara and go to the museum, the main cultural museum, historic museum in Ankara. There you will see everything, all the artifacts that were found here, and then you can go there, because here there are no artifacts. These are graves, by the way. They buried the dead under the floor of the houses, which, again, we don't know why exactly, but it's very useful because it means there were lots of skeletons found, which also tell us a great deal, some of which I will discuss. And there are 18 levels, so it's, in a way, it's difficult to separate them out when you're watching, but that's why they're sort of at different heights. Okay, this is a model house that's just by the mound, built to give a flavour of what it was like in the houses. Don't worry about this, that's so tourists can go in. In fact, there was no such entrance. You go up and in through a hole in the roof. This is the inside. That was, it is red. It's not there now, but as I say, it's been carried, the whole wall has been carried to Ankara. We don't know what this is. This could be a plan of the village. that might be a picture of a nearby semi-active volcano, which at that time was semi-active. We don't know. Others have suggested it's leopard spots, because just by the by, it's not particularly relevant, but it's interesting. Ian Hodder wrote a wonderful book about Catalhoyuk, and one of the things he goes on and on about in the book is that the leopard obviously plays an important role in whatever culture this was, because, you know, the figurines, the paintings, everything has leopard skins, leopards on them, and yet not a single leopard bone was found in Catalhoyuk. And loads of bones of all the animals of the area were in there, but not leopards. And then at the end of the book, you get right to the end of this 300-400 page book, there's a short epilogue which says, we just found a tiny, but it really is a tiny bit of leopard bone. So, you know, some people have argued that might be a leopard skin pattern. There's the skulls. Now, that's one of the figurines which Mellard found in the 60s. And immediately went, Mother Goddess. And since then, mainly American Mother Goddess worshippers visit the place and do what Mother Goddess worshippers do, I'm not quite sure, in Konya. However, as I will explain, it now looks like it probably was not a matriarchal society with the cults of the Mother Goddess. But they did find a large-ish number of such similar figurines. And sorry, she's sitting, these are leopard heads. So she's sitting on a chair with two leopard heads. Shall I leave that on? That's a nicer thing to look at. Okay. Now, there's a number of things about Catalhoyuk which are very interesting and surprising in some ways. First of all, I mentioned when we're looking at the plan of the village, all the houses are more or less, 2,000 houses we're talking about, are more or less the same size. There are no public spaces, no administrative, different looking, larger buildings, no larger or more elaborate houses which one would assume would be elites, richer, wealthier occupants. No streets. And in the bottom 6 layers, all the houses really are the same size. From the 6th and 7th layers up, in other words, later in time, closer to our time, you do apparently begin to get some houses which are larger. But what they've done is they've compared what they found in the houses, and it's no different. So even in the later period, when there are bigger houses, what's in the bigger house and the smaller houses is the same. There are signs of work in both of those, in the larger houses as well. So Mellard, for example, thought the larger houses were shrines, and he called them shrines. But in fact, there's signs of flakes, and because you know they make axes and what are they called? Various implements for cutting by flaking off either obsidian or flint, and you find that. So if it was a shrine, there was work going on in there. So we don't know what it was. So all the houses, both in the earlier and the later period, look similar. Possibly, at the moment no one knows, there was beginning to get to some differentiation was beginning to happen in the later period. But in the first 1,000 years or so, all the houses are the same. Secondly, there is absolutely no sign of a division of labour between people in different houses. As I said, there is sign of work done in every house, but more fascinatingly, and I just find it fascinating how they get to this piece of information. The houses are made of mud bricks, and the mud brick is made up of mud, ash, sort of crushed up bones, a bit of hay, and they've done detailed chemical analysis between the bricks from different houses, and the composition of the brick is slightly different in every house. Conclusion, every house was making their own bricks, because if bricks were made by the same people whose job it was to make mud bricks, you'd expect the same formula. So every house was built by whoever was living in the house. The bins meaning holes, storage bins in the houses indicate that these are storage bins for agricultural products, indicates that basically every house has more or less the same storage capacity. So you don't have a house, you know, with a huge surplus. Each house had its own hearth, oven, obsidian cache, because they used to bury a little bit of obsidian in a hole under the house. But every house had that. Storage rooms, workrooms, etc. So there is no division of labour between houses, and there's no apparent difference in wealth between the houses. There is no sign of war. Now, I'd be reluctant, and Hodder certainly doesn't, and I'd be reluctant to argue that there was no war, but there are no skeletons, and as I've mentioned, loads of skeletons have been found. There are no skeletons which show damage caused by weapons. Of course they had weapons, they had bows and arrows, and they had spears and whatnot, but they were obviously for hunting, because none of the skeletons which have been found, we're talking of hundreds, showed signs of the person having been killed by a weapon. Now, oops, this is interesting. There is no, well, I put down private ownership of children. People with children, please forgive me. But children were born and distributed amongst the houses. So children would not live in the same house as their biological parents. They know this because children also die, at that time more than today, and were buried under the houses. And they checked, and they did DNA analysis. And you know, there is no pattern. There's no families under the house, buried in the house. I think this is possibly one of the most unexpected pieces of information. And finally, the role of women. At the time when digging started by Mallards, there's a long tradition in Europe that, a long previous tradition in Europe, that these societies were patriarchal. From the 18th century onwards, the view changed, and there was a strong argument which became prevalent that these societies were matriarchal with mother goddesses, etc. So male arts, being part of this tradition, immediately interpreted this to mean this Catalhoyuk to be a matriarchal society. In fact, over the past 22 years of digging, there has been no evidence of that, nor has there been any evidence of a patriarchal society. So, for example, the strongest evidence of relative status between men and women comes from diet. In patriarchal societies, you analyse the bones, and you know what they've been eating, and you find men have been eating more meat, better food. Here, this is not the case. All sorts of isotope analyses, etc., have been done on the male and female bones, and no differences have been found in diet. Another indicator is that in one particular building, there were 62 people buried under the floor, and the analysis of these skeletons shows absolutely no difference between male and female, and the same goes for teeth, which is an even better indicator of what people were eating. Male and female teeth were indistinguishable in these terms. The pattern of wear and tear on bones is also an indicator of lifestyle, what sort of work people were doing. Once again, no difference between men and women. One particularly odd piece of evidence is that because there were no windows and there were burning fires in the houses, the plastering on the walls is full of soot. If you're breathing, so are your ribs full of soot. Archaeologists can see the soot on the ribs. Male and female ribs had exactly the same amount of soot on them. So it wasn't the case that women spent more time in the house and men went out hunting and having parties. All the evidence indicates similar diets and similar lifestyles between men and women. As far as status is concerned, there's another interesting thing about Catalhoyuk. They buried people, and occasionally they would dig the skeleton up, cut off the skull, plaster over it and make a human face on it, and keep it in the house, sometimes embedded in the walls, as were the bull's heads. So we don't know, but chances are these were heads in more ways than one. So they were family heads, or people who were considered to be elders or important in one way or another. There are the same numbers of male and female skulls which have been cut off and embedded in the wall, etc. So even there we find no evidence of any difference between men and women. They've looked into whether men and women were buried perhaps in different parts, under the different parts of the house. Again, no difference. It seems to be completely arbitrary between men and women. So, it doesn't seem to be a matriarchal society, but nor is it a patriarchal society. Hodder himself has written, "The picture looks quite coherent thus far. When we examine how people live their daily lives, what they ate, what they did, where they were buried, who was paramount in terms of lineage and family, we see little in the way of radical division between men and women, no evidence for patriarchy or matriarchy. What we are seeing is a society in which, in many areas, the question of whether you were a man or a woman did not determine the life you could lead." I was surprised by finishing a little bit early. Not yet, but nearly. Now, I really think that had Marx, or more specifically Engels, visited this place or read the various publications on it, particularly Hodder's book, or listened to my talk, they really would have been thrilled. But I don't think they would have been surprised by any of it, because although all they had to go by, as most of you know, was the works of an American archaeologist, Lewis Morgan, who had basically studied current societies, Native American societies, and theorized about it. But that's all that Marx and Engels actually had to go by. Marx started reading Morgan, never got round to writing much about it, and then, as you know, Engels took it up. But that's it. There was nothing. And yet, then we find the stuff, and it is very much in line with what reading Marx and Engels would lead us to believe. Finally, there are two just intriguing things which I find interesting about this village. Was 7,500 BC to about 6,000 BC. About 2000 BC, so 3,000 or 4,000 years after the village was vacated, somewhere around there you get the Hittites. No one knows where the Hittites came from. The Hittites had writing, so we know what they spoke. They spoke an Indo-European language. And there are two theories about where they came from. One is that they came from north of the Black Sea, round here. And that's where Indo-European starts, north of the Black Sea. That's one theory. The other theory is that Indo-Europeans started in Anatolia and moved west into Europe with agriculture. So if the latter theory is true, and for no good reason at all, I tend to believe it is, then I would think the people in Catalhoyuk were at least part of the people who then became the Hittites, and also the people who moved that way, taking agriculture and Indo-European into Europe. I'm sure we will find out at some point through DNA analysis, but I just find this fascinating, because when I was walking through the ruins of the village, I kept thinking, what the hell would they be talking about? And what language? Of course, there'd be no name for the language, but what did it sound like? Possibly it was an Indo-European language, which means it wouldn't have sounded very odd to us at all. That's just, I find interesting and exciting, politically not at all relevant, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, thank you.
To conceive of a society that basically has no politics, and by that period you mean religion, with what we can see through the Venus statue and the bull, it's difficult to grasp it. And remember, we're in a Neolithic, very primitive time. It's the height of the Stone Age, farmers there. Now, the bull cult was all over the Mediterranean, largely followed by societies which would be difficult to describe as egalitarian. Right? I think we're all admitted in that, as far as that one. Now, as for the origins of Indo-European languages, disagree with you entirely. Absolutely disagree with you entirely. So you're forgetting one thing. There is no, as far as I can see, any cultural continuity between that society and the Hittites. The Hittites are described as the Romans of the Bronze Age. Indeed, they're worse than that. They had iron. Right? That gave them a massive technological edge over the Egyptians, who were their major competitors in the area. It is the case, though.
There's 4,000 years.
I accept that. But when you look at the history of the language and you say, where did they come from, you have to say it's Caucasian. And by Caucasian I mean from the Caucasus, I don't mean white. Right? That's where all of our principal language groups currently spoken in Eastern and Western Europe, possibly with the exception of Slavic, come from, as far as I'm aware. Right? Now, it is the case, and it gets less as you get further west, that up to 36% of the genetic evidence would presuppose that every one of us has 36% of our genes. I hate using these things because they're all difficult. I mean, you look at this population in here now, how the hell can you say that? But anyway, have up to 36% of our genes come from Mesopotamia. Now, that is basically Greater Mesopotamia, right? Part of the Fertile Crescent kind of area. So, I cannot see that we have finished looking at that, and I know you're not saying that, Ronnie, right? And I cannot think that we should be taking that as proof positive of egalitarianism in early human society, organised early human society, because I don't think the evidence exists for it. The two things that to me negate it is the bull cult and the mother goddess. Now you can argue which side of that, but to me the bull cult wins out in the end.
Every year when I look at the programme for Marxism, I hope there's going to be a programme on speaking on archaeology. Yeah. I think last time, about 6 years ago, Neil Faulkner did one or two. So I'm delighted, because the thing is that when I joined the movement in the late 60s, one of the people that we used to read was an Australian Marxist archaeologist called Gordon Child. And I was speaking to an archaeology tutor last week at the City Lit, who's Australian, and he's excellent. And I said to him, how important is Gordon Child in Australian archaeology nowadays? He said he's at the top, and he's at the top over here. He said he's at the top because he's the first person who actually looks at human society, and instead of reassembling pots and looking at bones and trying to put dates on something, tries to talk about how human society developed. Okay? Now the second point is that our own country is interesting now, because over the last couple of years they've found out that humans have been in Britain, in Norfolk in particular, for 900,000 years. But as over the last million years you've had about 9 or 10 ice ages, it appears that what's happened in Britain is you get a kind of hokey-cokey. When it gets warm, people move from northern Spain into Britain, and then when it's cold again they move back. So you've got to remember that this probably happened in this part of the world as well, because, you know, ice ages affected it. Another point I'd like to make, if you actually look at the most common form of art in all human society, it's the fertility symbol. One that I'm aware of, for example, is 40,000 years ago approximately in Ukraine, they were carving them out of mammoth bones. Yeah? Last point I'll make is this: if you really want to understand Marxist explanation of history, you've really got to go back to look at ancient history and look at archaeology, because it gives you some really good, excellent perspective. And the last point I'll make is this: people outside this institution will say that we think as individuals, and there's something called human nature, which is basically look after yourself. Now, if you bear in mind that for 95% of the time that humans have been on this planet, it's been hunter-gatherers, and if they hadn't cooperated, because, you know, they didn't have central heating and homes, they would have never survived. So humans had to be cooperative and live and look after one another, otherwise they wouldn't have existed. The person who went out and said, I'm going to hunt, go back and eat everything, plus cook, plus make some clothes, wouldn't have survived.
And I think it's really useful that you put it in the context of Engels and the origins of the family, private property and the state, because really this is what it's about, isn't it? It's an argument about, can we have a different kind of society? Has society, has capitalism or has class society always existed? And these kind of examples start to suggest that this is not the case at all. And I'm quite interested really, I mean I agree with what the other speaker just said about Gordon Chow as well, because I think that's one of the best explanations around, but also Eleanor Leacock. I think the stuff that she wrote in her book was really, really useful. And I was wondering, in Eleanor Leacock's book, she talks about the Montagna Nascarpi and the way in which the Jesuits, they lived in the Labrador Peninsula in Canada, and the Jesuits came in and decided they were going to change the kind of structures that their families had, and they wrote down what they were going to do, and they said that they hated the way in which they lived their lives because they were promiscuous. They said, we love all the children, we don't care who's they're born from, we love them all, and they had that was that promiscuity they had. And I know you said that the children lived in different buildings, and I wondered whether or not there was evidence that they lived in pairs inside the houses, or whether or not there was, again, in this early society that started to settle, whether or not there was promiscuity as well. So I think it's quite important to know that, because Engels talks about the historic defeat of women in terms of the idea that property is passed on through the male line, and that's the historic defeat of women. And therefore it's quite interesting to know what you think about this. But whatever was the case, it does show you that people did not live in the same kind of class societies that we live in today, and that means that we can get rid of capitalism and live in a free, egalitarian society in the future.
But one thing I want to make a comment about the position of women, because it's absolutely precious information, because the idea that oppression is linked to the development of class society is always under challenge. And if you look at the debates in the anthropology journals at the time that Eleanor Leacock was publishing her findings, it was clear that everyone in academia knew that if she won the argument that women weren't oppressed at some point, they would have to admit that humans lived in egalitarian societies. It was around the other way. But anyway, they understood that if they were going to maintain the idea that it's natural to be in a hierarchical society, they had to defeat Eleanor Leacock's findings that the Escarpis were not a hierarchical society. And I think so, with like the last speaker, I think it does show that humans for millennia, or whatever the word would be, more than that, lived in egalitarian societies, and it's possible, again, on a different basis. The other person I think needs some recognition is the feminist writer Karen Sachs as well. But the interesting thing about Catalhoyuk is that it's based on a society that's more settled. We'd always thought for a long time that it was gatherer-hunter societies. I did some study of the Aborigines in Australia. But this is so important because for so long people lived in a settled society, and they began to develop, more complicated techniques and move towards the later period towards some more settled agriculture and even some herding. And yet the resistance to becoming hierarchical seems to exist. So I was going to ask Ronnie, because when I read about it, before the period you talked about, which I think you're talking about, there's evidence that there had become a more differentiated society, and there was a revolution all through that region. And one of the Turkish archaeologists that worked on it, I spoke to him by email once or twice, and disgracefully I can't actually remember his name, but you might know who I'm referring to.
Özaydınlı?
Yes, I think it must be. And he didn't have the final proof, but he was absolutely convinced that against this newly establishing group that appeared to be becoming like a ruling class, there had been a revolution where basically any symbols of their rule over society had been totally destroyed and turned into rubbish tips and all kinds of things, unlike the destruction of the houses, which was a routine. This has different features about it, so if Ronnie knows anything about that, and whether the later information, because I haven't studied it now for some years, but the fact that that happened, I think, helps to explain as well why most of humanity actually never became class societies until they were impacted by modern capitalist colonisation. which is something that's often forgotten because it's so naturalised now that we all live in the sort of class societies we know, and the societies that were colonised, people, the history of the non-class societies that, egalitarian societies that existed before has been lost in a lot of situations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the comrade said about the bull cult militating against an egalitarian society. I don't think it's as comprehensive a point as he was making, because the Minoan civilization of Crete and Thera certainly was the bull cult society, the bull leaping and so on in classes, but the wall paintings and sketches show an exuberant example of women dressed in, dressed to go out in the marketplace, not as confined or obscured or demure women, and it's actually and that seems coexist with the bull cult. I don't think it's a different point.
Okay, thank you. Comment down here.
Yes, just a couple more questions to add to the mix. I think what's most fascinating about what you were talking about was the egalitarian nature of the evidence that we can see the evidence that we can see of the egalitarian nature, but on the subject of the children. They reckon that the men were buried underneath the man of the house's bed, and the woman and the children were buried underneath the woman's bed. The idea that the children were not necessarily biologically related to the parents is fascinating. Just a question, I know there is evidence from Celtic mythology that there was a very prevalent custom of fostering children. However, that's really referring to a much later society. This is a ruling class thing where you would send your child to your enemy's family to be fostered as a guarantee against you waging warfare against them and stuff. So there's that question. The other question I want to ask is, what is the advantage, A, of living in such a large, this is a very large grouping for a hunter-gatherer society, Also, what is the advantage of entering your houses from the roof? You look at there's no city walls. I mean, city walls didn't develop until way later than that, As you say, there's no evidence of warfare. Why did they need to have this inconvenient, situation? I mean, they could have just spread out a bit, and they could have had cities and doorways and windows and whatnot, and lived a much kind of nicer lifestyle. And two suggestions that I can think of. Maybe it's protection against wild animals. Also, I'm wondering if maybe it's a response to, environmental. Factors. Somebody was talking about the ebbing and flowing of ice ages. Also, I cannot remember when it was, but at some point the Black Sea switched from being freshwater to seawater. So at some point those straits opened up in some kind of catastrophic event. When was that? When was that? I think so.
Okay. The guy in the black and white striped top.
I was particularly intrigued at what Ron was saying about the issue of wear and tear on bones, which you can establish through DNA, because I sometimes wrote an article on disability for the ISJ, and when I wrote that article, there was practically no evidence available at all on the question of whether people looked after other people in older societies that couldn't look after themselves. And in the last 4 or 5 years, only the last 4 or 5 years, there have actually come to light a whole number of studies which have basically been on DNA, through DNA analysis, of bones of people, and I had to look up my notes to check, as diverse as from Iraq, modern day Iraq, North Vietnam, Morocco, France and Kenya. Remains have been found which very clearly indicate people that had very severe impairments they would have absolutely not been able to survive had it not been for the case that it had been looked after by other people in a society. And given that the old stereotype of hunter-gatherer societies or whatever, you know, whether from the Inuit or from North American Indians, was that, you know, you would essentially walk out to die, you know, once your time was done and you were no longer productive in society. There is now hard scientific evidence proving in a whole number of cases that that was not the case. Now that doesn't mean, incidentally, that you can simply read off through some sort of economic reductionism, if you like, that because a society, you know, didn't have enough surplus or whatever, that they would therefore behave like that. The point of the matter is, we now have evidence of societies where there must have been, you know, quite a precarious life in terms of producing the means to survive, where that's definitely not the case, where actually there's evidence that people looked after other people that weren't actually able to look after themselves. And I think that's an enormously important development, because although you might not be able to go so far as to conclusively prove that there was egalitarian society, that was primitive communism on the basis of the scientific evidence, you put together a lot of these scattered findings, actually we can make very educated assumptions about what kind of societies actually did exist that long ago.
To come back on some of the points that have been made, and in particular on the question about evidence of class struggle. It's not my own knowledge, I use my phone to get back. I came across that issue a couple of years back at the end of one of the ISJ, when Chris Harman picked up an article. And the interesting thing about that article, it was not about just the interpretation of evidence, but a comparison of two different settlement cities, at roughly speaking the same place. And the other one in that article is Kayunu, that you can find on the right hand side of it. And what they found, that place is slightly older than Catalhoyuk, but has evidence of a class society with bigger house, the bigger house having most of the tools, slums on the side or whatever. But what was exciting reading that article was also the fact that at some point there was also evidence of what the author of that article called a revolution. Big house being burned down, temple being burned down, transformed into the communal dumping space or whatever. And that situation lasted for a couple of thousand years before gradually, as the city, I can't remember, was abandoned or basically turned back into a more class-based society. And what was interesting in that article is not just the interpretation, but also the methodology for interpretative archaeology, which is you don't just base your interpretation on what you can see, but also on comparison and by ruling out evidence once you get all the thing. And that was quite good by showing that at roughly speaking the same time you had an example of an egalitarian society for one, but also an example of a class-based society, and of course archaeological evidence of a revolution. My God.
Yeah, I've got another question. Thanks, Ronnie, for a really fascinating talk. But the thing that really has blown my mind is the randomness of the connection between the children and the other people in the same households as them, because that's such a challenge to conventional views about relationships between parents and children, and so on and so forth. I mean, it leads me to speculate about how we could explain that. I mean, you know, it sounds like either there's some sort of redistribution of children that goes on at birth, that birth parents don't keep the children, or the other thing that occurred to me is maybe there's a continuous process of redistribution of the houses, so that people don't stay in the same dwelling. And either way, I mean, you know, there are clearly people who know much more about this kind of stuff than me here, but one of the things that struck me in what I've read about hunter-gatherer societies, I mean, this is more advanced than a hunter-gatherer society, but probably still in all sorts of ways marked by its historical origins, is that they took systematic measures to stay egalitarian. For example, making fun of people who had a, you know, particularly large mammoth or whatever, so that they wouldn't get above themselves, and so on and so forth. Could it be, you know, could we see this, the redistribution of children, if that's what's going on, as such an egalitarian device? In other words, we come out of societies where everything was shared because the society was on the move, so there was a collective responsibility to look after the children. We create a device that continues that, even though we're living in more settled conditions. Anyway, that's...
See them emerging at different times in different places, in different forms of society. So we can see them in hunter-gatherer societies as well as in settled agricultural societies. But the one point they are very strong, or I think we can draw from it very strongly, is although there may be fluidity in this, there may not be a single way in which class societies emerge. It's without doubt inequality and hierarchy come together in the form of the class-based societies. So I think I'd be interested in your comments around that in relation to this. My question is really, again, is there any evidence of why this society ended? Or what led to the end of this society?
The answer is they don't know why it ended. There's no indication. They don't know. There are actually two mounds, the East Mound and the West Mound. Clearly, they seem to have abandoned the main mound, which is everything we've seen, and moved to the other one, and then the other one gets abandoned. There is no indication of why. Similarly, Susie's question about why such a big settlement, because it really is. The main difference between Catalhoyuk and all the others, all the little black dots here are Neolithic settlements. Catalhoyuk, far and above, is the most crowded, the biggest one. We don't know why. I mean, okay, it's well situated, there's a river, but it's even not perfectly well situated because they discovered that the agricultural land was quite a bit of a walk away from the settlement. And, you know, they just don't know why. The point about, Alex's point about children, the problem is that Ian Hodder is not a Marxist. And it is really frustrating when you read his stuff or listen to him. That, I mean, this is what my talk is just taken from Hodder. But you have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to pick out the sorts of thing I talked about and we discussed. Because these are not the things that concern Ian Hodder. He's much more concerned with the bull. I don't give a bull about the bull. You know, I don't find that's not my main interest. So as a result, he doesn't particularly discuss the question of why the children would have been like that. But also, this is very new information. The bones are not very well preserved, so it was for a long time difficult to extract DNA from them, and it still is very difficult. So it's only very new that they've succeeded in doing it, which is the only way they can tell whether the kids belong to that particular house. So I really don't know what was going on because Hodder doesn't address the issue. The question of were they nuclear families, again, we don't know. I mean, I think that's a fascinating question. The fact that the kids were distributed tends to indicate that probably not. But to what degree not, we don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But again, these are, if the SWP was in charge of the dig, I think that's the sort of issue we'd address, but we're not. Right, you mentioned the word proof positive in your contribution. Now, as you know, nothing about this, except for, you know, isotope analysis on the bones, that sort of thing, nothing is proof positive. You know, for example, one of the Mother Goddess figurines without the head was found in a midden. It was in a rubbish bin. Now, we could have all sorts of theories built on that. It might be that it sort of moved there later on, where peasants were partying about it. You know, so nothing, you know, we always have a tendency, because the human mind has this tendency of categorizing, having neat time periods and neat transitions. It's not like that. Or, you know, it's just an ongoing mess, and the people living through that clearly have no idea. No one there is thinking, oh good, we're now moving to a settled society, aren't we? You know, it doesn't happen like that. All of these societies are partly settled, partly still they do some of the things that hunter-gatherers do. Nothing is proof positive and nothing is black and white. But you favour the north of the Black Sea, I favour Renfrew for no good reason, as I said, but it just sounds, it feels right to me, that's all I can say. If I was a professor of archaeology, I'd probably have been sacked for saying this, but I'm not, so it's okay. Okay, a couple of comrades brought up what you called something in French, I think. It's Chayonu, which is there. Chayonu, the only reason I didn't mention it in my talk is that that requires a talk all to itself, and maybe we should have one next year. Chayonu is interesting. I can't remember now how many layers, how many levels it has. Let me just say, rather than say X, let me say 10. The bottom 5 layers clearly is a class of, well, okay, let's not say class society, but class differentiation is clear to see. There are big houses, there are shrines, religious buildings. All the signs of inequality are there. Level 6 is black. It's been burnt to the ground. The whole settlement has been burnt to the ground. Level 6 is ash. Level 7 is completely egalitarian. It's very much like Catalhoyuk, and it, you know, the top 5, 6, whatever layers are like that. Now, Chayonu is about 1,000 years earlier than Catalhoyuk, and all the ones in between are egalitarian. Bear in mind, these things basically start here and move that way. So by the time they've got here, well, again, you see, I'm doing something simplistic, and probably it certainly was not simplistic. By the time they get there, there is inequality. Then there is something which looks like a revolution. But God knows, maybe there was a bloody fire, you know. But it does look, apparently, like a revolution. And then from the ashes up, it's egalitarian. All of these are egalitarian. And here, as I mentioned, from level 6 up, you do begin to get slightly bigger houses. Perhaps differentiation was starting again. But we don't know, you know, it's hard to tell. That's it.